this is my first moderation, so I get to play Phil Donahue today. So like Lorianne said, I am the Executive Secretary to the State Records Committee. Been doing that for about 1.5 years, and it has been a great learning curve, and I can tell you, being here all day, listening to GRAMA, I learned even more. So hopefully everything that you learned today, we can direct to the panelists as far as when it comes to emails, and I want this to be lively, so please ask lots of questions. We're trying to focus on emails as far as GRAMA requests and responding to the emails, but if we, kind of go down a couple other different avenues, we can do that. And I'd just like to say this topic has been highlighted, especially at the Records Committee. We've had 16 appeals come through last year dealing with emails, and already we have about 7 of them coming through this year dealing with email requests. And I don't know how many of you were here for the keynote speaker, but talking about Google Vault, who is going to search and filter information. So all that kind of stuff is what the committee talks about. And then the panelists up here, they have experience with that. And so please ask questions. That's what we're here for, to learn. So the first panelist we have here is David Fleming, and he is the Private Sector Records Manager, and he represents also the State Records Committee, and he is the Chair Pro Tem. And then we have Colleen Mulvey, and she is the City Recorder for the City of Cedar Hills. Candy Allred on the end. She is the GRAMA Coordinator and Paralegal for the Salt Lake City Police Department. And Michelle Larsen, who we heard earlier today. She is a Senior Records Officer for Utah Transit Authority, UTA. So thank you. So we do have some questions that we put together just to kind of get this panel going. So the first one on the list is David. So the SRC is beginning to hear more appeals for email communication. For example, the recent one that we heard was Sullivan versus the Utah Insurance Department. During that appeal, the petitioner raised the question about the user of the account being the one who searched, gathered, and redacted the information. And these were valid concerns, and we heard a little bit about that earlier today as well. Can you address the concerns raised by the committee with the agencies not utilizing their records officers, or maybe not able to search email accounts for responsive records?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
I'm going to approach the question both from my experience on the State Records Committee as well as my experience as the Corporate Records Manager for ZIons Bancorporation, where I managed, or I'm responsible for supporting the legal hold process and managing the e-discovery process. And so I'd start off by just saying that for self-preservation, regardless of whether or not you need to produce records under GRAMA or not, email is going to contain records, and the committee has pretty much considered email as a record. Okay, so if you've got email and you're doing your organizational business in this email account, it doesn't matter whether it's a personal account or a work account, it's going to be responsive to the request, and we're likely to find in favor of the requester in terms of whether or not you should produce it, unless it's protected or private. So having said that, you need to be prepared to produce email efficiently from all sources. And you need to know what your sources are, and you need to hopefully have control over those sources. I know in smaller entities, smaller municipal entities, that's not always possible, and a lot of council members use their personal email to do city business. And I think that's a problem for you in terms of being able to find it. But as far as the case, Sullivan versus Utah Insurance Department, the concern was that the insurance department had the owner of the account search the email for responsive records from a e-discovery perspective, that's probably not a good option. It calls your process into question, and we're likely to question you more heavily if you're in front of the State Records Committee on that. And so I would, I don't want to talk too much on my first question here, but I do think that one of the big problems that we have in a lot of the municipal entities is this issue of how work gets done on personal email accounts. And I do think that if you haven't addressed that issue, you need to address that issue. Either make sure that your council understands or your employees understand that if they do company business on a personal account, it's not private. And so that we're going to need to be able to search that, and we're not necessarily going to be able to rely on you to search that. We're going to have you produce it so that a records officer can produce it. And I would heavily recommend that a records officer be the one to do that.
Okay, you brought up some really great points, and we're going to kind of explore some of those other things that you talked about as far as private emails, and we'll get a little bit more into that a little bit later. Michelle, we've had a couple of appeals come up from UTA, and I know you have a lot of experience with email communications. Could you kind of provide some background and as far as, do you have records officers go through accounts, or is it individuals that go through accounts?
Our best practice is to have a records officer do the search through the accounts. This is so that we catch everything that is required and there's not a self-filtering process. Sometimes if it's your email account and you come across something like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, you have that want to censor, and it just needs to be produced. Having said that, we have received GRAMA requests where they want us to search 250 email accounts for about 30 different topics, and they want it for a 7-year period. This is my most recent one last year. And given the timeframes that we were working under, we had to make some decisions. And so we went back to the requester and explained with the volume that they were seeking and with the number of accounts, we would not follow this best practice, but we would have the individual address holder do that request search. Otherwise, there's just no way we could have been responsive in a timely fashion. And it was up to them to make that determination. If they decided that they wanted the records officer to do that, we would have done it, but we would have let them know exactly, what is we would ask like an order, if, give me your top 10 and we'll start with that and we'll do it in groupings, because it was a time-intensive exercise, especially once we got all the records assembled, and then to have to go through and segregate them and make sure, because of the topic, that we were not divulging any sensitive security information having to do with infrastructure on our rail system. And so our best practice is always to have a records officer do the searching and collecting, but sometimes there's problems and you just need to make sure you communicate that with the requester so they understand the parameters under which you can operate.
All right, thank you. Candy, we were discussing the panel topics. Yours is a little unique because you said you only had a couple of email requests, but you had something else that you wanted to talk about as far as your litigation and how you manage that and access. So can you go ahead and elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Yeah, so we don't get a lot of email requests. If they do, they're pretty pointed. We want all emails, from your officers telling the chief why he did this specific action. Well, our officers are in the field, and they're not going to email the chief of police. So we don't get a lot. Those requests that we have got, we just don't have any records responsive to that. But the emails that we do come in contact with are usually pursuant to a litigation hold or potential litigation. And at that point, we will send out, we've devised a survey type of document that asks, what's your main directory? What's your email address? Where do you send those emails from? All your phone numbers, do you have an iPad? All of that information. And if it's a pre-notice of claim, pre-litigation, then we ask them, if you do receive any emails, please put it in a folder in your Outlook. So we try and and it's mostly our sergeants, lieutenants, administration who are questioning policy or making some sort of determination back and forth, that we request all emails be put in an Outlook folder just to start that process in case we do get a notice of claim or, a request for those emails. And we try and have our administration get in the routine of any sort of those emails being automatically put in this folder for a couple of reasons. One, it gets them in the habit of saving those emails. And two, IMS, our information management system, knows exactly where they are. Now, given that, if we do get a notice of claim, our IMS people do go back and perform a secondary search, just for the reasons for. So if somebody didn't think that was important, well, all emails are important. So our IMS will go through, pull out every email from that specific person for a time frame and give it to me. And then I get to go through those emails and pick out the emails that are important for litigation.
All right, thank you. And lastly is Colleen. This was before my time. There was an appeals to the State Records Committee. If any of you want to look it up, it's Kramer versus Cedar Hills. And it was really interesting. I read it. I read the decision. Colleen, can you explain how you began the process of such a voluminous request for emails? And can you provide some examples of the technology that you used back then, if it was useful, metadata, if that was involved? It was a very interesting case.
Actually, there wasn't much technology being used back then. It was pretty much printed out on paper and whited out. That's the way that they always did it. Back in 2012, this was the first time the city received a request, and it was pretty much for every email between the mayor and city council and city manager from like a year and a half. And at that point in time, our city council and mayor were using their personal emails. So we had to not only go with what was on the city's email, which none of them have, they do now, but none of them had back then. And then it was former council people too. So we had to track them down, and it was a real mess. And then they were using, I don't even remember what it was called. It was a redaction program, electronic one, but guess what? It didn't work. So the requester actually got some private information that they weren't supposed to, so we asked for it back and that. So that's why we ended up printing out, and it was thousands and thousands of pages, and just manually redacting them, because at that time we didn't. Now I use Adobe Pro, which is wonderful. It redacts and you can't break into it. I mean, I'm sure somebody can hack into it, but you'd have to be a genius. So it was really a struggle, because we got the request in March and it was just huge. I mean, there were so many emails, and then we had to go find council people who are no longer council people and try to get them to get us. And so we got accused of stalling and hiding information, and it really wasn't what we were doing. So at that point, it was just the decision of the then city manager and a city attorney to do everything on paper, which took even longer. And so it was pretty expensive. And then the requester also paid partial, so he got partial, and then claimed that we were stalling again or whatever. And so finally, when he paid, we gave him the records that he wanted, but I mean, it was just a huge ordeal. So what we learned from that was we needed to find a software that really was good at redacting, and Adobe Pro is what we use. I love it, use it all the time. Every elected official now uses a city-sanctioned email address. They're not to use their personal one, and they know that. And the other thing too, that was 4 years ago. I mean, we have requesters that constantly ask for these emails. So basically what we've done is our city council has approved that I'm the certified records officer. I have complete access to our server now. So I can go in at any time, any day, anybody's email without their permission If I have a GRAMA request for email and get what I need and get out. And it's actually worked, it's saved time, not for me, but for everyone else. And so, and the beauty of this is now the responses that in the city council and the mayor, when they talk to each other, it's like, sure, see you at the meeting or whatever. They have really gotten better about what they're saying in their emails. Not to say that they don't talk about city business, because there are some that they do, but because we have this frequent request, or we've just gotten really smart about what we put in our emails. And if you heard Susan earlier today, she gave that example of, you say something really stupid in an email, guess what? That goes out there in the public. There's no expectation of privacy whatsoever when you use a company-owned or a city-owned or whatever entity. Anybody can GRAMA request it. The only thing they don't get is if it's protected, controlled, private type of thing. I don't know, did I answer your question, or did I just keep rambling on?
No, you did. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Can I just say that she hit on two really important points that I kind of alluded to, which is getting control of your email, having a repository of email that's searchable, so that you don't have to print out thousands of emails on a piece of paper and read them manually. You have a tool that helps you find what is responsive quickly, and you avoid ever coming to the State Records Committee because you were able to find what was responsive. You were able to do it without spending a ton of resources, and then you are also protected when you're also ready for any kind of litigation, because that could cost you too. But there's manual processes involved here until you have a tool like that. And that tool may sound expensive, but you have to look at the cost of doing it without a tool.
Costs $14.99 a month for one user,
Go ahead.
for Adobe Pro, yeah.
Adobe
I'm
Pro.
just going to add one more thing about searching. It's really important that you document each search that you do, so that when you end up at the State Records Committee and someone is alleging that you didn't do a thorough search, you have a record of what exactly you searched, what your parameters were, and what your results were. So I will put this is the email address, this was the date range, this is the key topic, and my results were 483 email.
So I thought Colleen didn't like me, but it turns out she just got a tool, and she hasn't been back to the Records Committee for 3 years.
Well, that's because the certain person who took us back that 3 or 4 times lost every time and we won. But it wasn't an easy process. We made a lot of mistakes and it took a lot of a learning curve. We do training twice a year with our employees just to remind them, guess what? These are records, these are not, save this, whatever. Right now, fortunately or unfortunately, we are under a litigation hold, so nobody's deleting anything. So I go into search now and I look for one subject and there's like 13,000 emails or whatever. And again, like they said earlier, you can charge for the time where you're sitting physically redacting. Can't charge for whether it needs to be redacted or not, but that physical time when you're redacting, you can charge. And that was one of the reasons, that's actually why we went to the State Records Committee, is because the person requesting was saying that what he's requesting was in the public interest and he should have it for free. And it really wasn't true.
All right, thank you. Well, they actually answered about 5 of the questions I already had lined up, so good on you. So let's talk about metadata. Has anyone had a request for metadata with their emails? And you did, Michelle? I think you talked about that.
Yeah, in a production that we did last year, they wanted all the metadata associated with that. So what we did, we are using Outlook, as we created a folder of the records that we were going to produce. And then we made sure that the IT department went through them and made sure the metadata was associated with it. Their server system sometimes shortcuts things to archive them. So they needed to run a program to make sure everything was unshortcutted. What happens with that is I can still see it because I'm on the archive system, but if I give it to someone outside of UTA, they won't be able to open it. So we had to run a whole bunch of procedures to make sure that was there, and then to make sure that the attachments with those emails also went through at the same time, and it took IT quite a bit of time to make that migration into we ended up using a terabyte external drive to give that to the requester.
And you mentioned attachments. There was a question I saw in here. Do attachments count for emails? Yes, that's part of the email. So if you're printing them out or making them into a PDF or whatever, you have to include all the attachments as well.
All right, does anybody in the audience have a question? Go for it. Hold on, Lorianne's coming.
So you talked about, Colleen, you talked about you can charge for time for redaction, but not to review it, correct? Or was I opposite?
Not to determine.
Not to determine, but to actually do it. Can you charge for the time? Because in my city, we have our IT department, our IT manager, they will, and I've had several over the last year, I bet you I've had probably 10 or 20 requests for emails for a year and a half. So we have our IT department do that. They give us an hour, like it's going to take them 8 hours to search it. Can we charge them for that time?
Pam?
That's part of compiling.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and I think that's specifically covered in GRAMA, and I think you can charge for the time of the lowest paid employee that can do the work. So if you have an IT guy, you can charge his hourly rate. But it's one thing that I've seen at the State Records Committee is it's good to have an established fee schedule. So it can't be, if you have an established fee schedule for that, then it's much harder to challenge at the State Records Committee. And the State Records Committee can't really determine the reasonableness of the fee. We're not allowed to do that under the law. So having your own fee schedule for that really makes a big difference in terms of defending the charges when you're in front of the State Records Committee for a fee waiver.
Can I just ask real quick? When you talk about the fee the fee that can be charged, it was made earlier in a comment that you cannot charge for benefits, only hourly rate.
That's not-
We add in benefits in
So do
ours.
I think that's why it's important to establish your fee schedule.
And then make sure your fee schedule's published on your website and publicly, so you're not accused of hiding it.
All right, I think we had a question up here. This gentleman right here where Melody's going.
So a question on the attachments. We recently had a request where IT had to pull a bunch of emails for us, and they pulled the emails with attachments. Our in-house legal then wanted to review that, and they put it into some type of software where it didn't recognize the attachments. Do you know if there's a way to make the attachments come across separately from the email, or is there a way to separate those?
Candy, do you do any of that?
I haven't run across where the attachment hasn't showed up. Do you know what program they used? No?
So let me get this straight. You're saying that the attorney felt like the attachments weren't responsive, or he just didn't want to review them, but so you're asking if there's a program that can identify a responsive email and separate it from the attachment?
Well, so he did want to review the attachments.
Okay.
But the issue was the fact that he wanted to review the attachments, but the issue was that when they put them into their software, which case management, then the attachments the link cannot be opened.
Oh, okay.
So we were trying to go back to IT to see if there's any way they could send those attachments separately.
Well, this is where I think you have to invest in e-discovery software or outside e-discovery services. But we have at ZIons, we have a e-discovery software that can not only search email and attachments, but all other document types as well. And it will tell you whether it's an attachment or not. And it will search both the content of the attachment as well as the body of the email. So yes, you can get software to do it. It's not cheap. But I don't know, does your software search attachments?
I just know they show, and I'm able to open them in that.
Okay, so you can look at them, but you don't know, if you're running a search for relevant information, to whatever the request is. You don't know whether or not is it searching text in the email? Is it searching text in the attachment? That's what you don't know for sure.
Yeah, I don't know, but.
I think that's a really good question because attachments, not every tool will search the content of an attachment.
Okay. Kendra?
Going back to the fee schedule, we don't have one yet because we're a small city and we don't have very many, but I see them coming. When we establish a fee on our fee schedule, we can put the salary of the lowest paid person that can do that. So if we put her amount on there, and then we have to have the IT guy come in and do this, how do we charge that higher rate if it's not on the fee schedule? Or do you just say on the fee schedule, the lowest?
Yes.
You don't have to
I
put an
say that-
amount.
Yeah, I put that statement on there. I do not put the dollar amount we charge per hour because it could change. And then just make sure whatever you charge for copies and stuff like that, you have on there as well.
Okay, thank you.
Hold on one second. Rebecca's down here.
So the library just went from, well, not just, but recently switched from Outlook to Google, just as their main provider. So do you guys know much about Google and like Google Drive and has anything come before the commission or the committee about Google Drive folder sharing or anything like that?
What a great question. So we've heard recent cases. In fact, I'm not sure that the most recent one where we had, do you remember the name of that?
Are you considering the Google Vault?
Yeah.
The Sullivan one again? Yes. Sullivan and AG.
That's what I thought it was. We hear from Mr. Sullivan quite a bit. He wanted, this was another case. It was a different agency, but the agency had again relied on the person who owned the account to search their email to see if there was anything responsive, and the requester wanted Google Vault searched. And some agencies have Google Vault and others don't. Some of it have it for some people and some not. But if you have it, it has to be searched, and it's probably the best source to search. You wouldn't, and again, you shouldn't rely on the owner of the account to do the search. But my understanding is there are quite a few state agencies that use Google Vault, and that has come up multiple times in front of the State Records Committee. And I would encourage you to read the definition of a record. There's nothing in GRAMA that would say that any email or any part of an email is not a record. So it's responsive to the request unless it's classified as private or protected. But as far as just using the public, do you have your own, I mean, you're just using Google on a public?
We have like a business account set up,
Okay,
so everybody in the organization is within it. So it's
Yeah.
actually better for grammar requests because we're all, there.
Yeah,
It's not just.
I don't know. I can tell you that if you have an e-discovery software, you can search any kind of email account with that. But I don't know much about I'm trying to learn to use Google myself because I've kind of separated. I've heard too many of these arguments, so I've recently separated all of my work stuff from my personal stuff, and I'm learning Google myself, so I can't really speak to it. Does anybody else?
Yeah, along with that, so since we did switch over from Outlook to Google, what if there are emails, say, sitting on the server over at the city from the old Outlook client that might pertain to some of the stuff that's being requested? I don't know.
If it's there, you have to search it still.
So,
Yeah.
Okay.
And that becomes a problem because you've gone to a different system and nobody's maintaining the old system in a lot of cases. But if it's there, you have to make a decision.
As I say, I might bring up, we have two different archive systems, and one of them was 1997 through 2006. So you can imagine the nightmare that was, and because we wanted to get rid of the old system, we have spent the last 3 years requiring people to go through and make a determination whether or not a record needed to be kept, because the federal government required it to be kept for as long as we have an asset, or if it pertained to something else. We made sure that we extracted all our executive correspondence out of it because it's permanent, so that we could actually finally do a purge. And so it may be an exercise that your entity may need to go through the old system, make a determination of what records out of there need to be migrated and what can actually be destroyed so that you don't have to keep maintaining it.
All right, we have another question up here. Go ahead, Melody.
So this goes to Colleen's case that she mentioned earlier. I'm a little confused as to why there was a duty under GRAMA to go back to former elected officials' personal emails, because a record is defined as something that's prepared, owned, or retained by a governmental entity, and governmental entity doesn't imply or mean former employees.
But at the time, those people he was asking for were the mayor and the city council people, because it was like a year and a half worth of emails. So the ones that were using their personal, even though at the time they're presently not a council member, they were back during that time frame, so we're responsible for those records.
And they were doing city business using that account. That's the key.
Okay, I have a question for the panel. Do any of you use iCloud or any type of third-party archiving system? I know we mentioned it a little bit, Michelle, when you were talking.
We use EMC Source One. We do that for two reasons. One, we have the live email system, but everything that goes through our email system is archived, because we never know if someone's going to inadvertently delete something, or we're going to have to go back and look for something that was destroyed according to retention, but perhaps there was a legal hold that someone didn't know about. And so we always try to keep at least a 7-year archive of our email.
That's a good point. You can't control the retention of email in individual email accounts. And it's even hard to do even if you're trying to control it on your primary email server, because the primary email server usually doesn't have enough capacity to archive email for that long. It will bog down and cease to function. So usually your email server has some sort of limit to how long it can retain email in the inbox. And I don't know about city entities, but at ZIons, it's 6 months, as long as it can stay on the email server. And that's just based on a, capacity issue.
Well, I'm in the middle of doing a GRAMA request for emails right now, and I don't know what our limit is, but I've already gone back to 2011, because when I go in and search now, I have all access, so it just gives me, I just put like a to and a from and what the subject is, and it'll pull it up. So obviously, but ZIons.
Is that searching an archive, or is that searching your primary email
It does
server?
everything in the entire thing. You can go, it's kind of cool the way that our IT
Yeah,
guys do it.
okay.
I don't know how it works, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff there, so it's pretty big. But I would imagine ZIons Bank is like way bigger than Cedar Hills. I mean,
Well, we have 10,000 email accounts.
well, there you go.
Well, and Salt Lake City uses Commvault, and when I was talking to the IMS people before I came, we're up to 8 terabytes of just archive information.
We have like 10 terabytes, and that's only for 700 of our 10,000 users. So it gets big fast.
It does.
Yeah, it does. So we have another question up here. Go ahead.
Well, that was kind of my question. What kind of retention have you, do you define it? I know with our county, it's a year. If it hits a year mark, it drops off. That's what they told us anyway.
Depends on whose retention schedule you're following.
So have you defined, each one of you have it defined in your retention schedule?
Not specifically for email because we don't consider this is a business. Okay, so we're not subject to GRAMA, first of all. So you got to keep that in mind. So GRAMA drives what you do, or your own retention schedule drives what you do, but you should at least know what your retention is and have it documented in policy. So I don't know I don't know if GRAMA really specifies how long you're supposed to keep email
Well-
but from our perspective, it's the content of the email that makes it a record or not, or makes it subject to a record category, retention period. I think the assumption on our side is that it's a communication tool. It's not a record-keeping system. So if you can define policies around that, I don't know if there's any reason that you can't destroy email after a year, but I think there are certain emails. I think it's safer for a government entity to assume that you should keep everything for a period of time that's reasonable. And under public records, I would think that a year is not going to be considered reasonable.
For municipalities, we have to either go by the state archives retention schedule, or we have the option of adopting our own by ordinance. So state archives, and I know Rosemary probably wants to say this too, is they've classified emails as correspondence. And so executive correspondence is permanent retention. Administrative correspondence is 7 years, and emails fall under that realm.
Okay, I'm going to let Michelle go ahead and make her comment, and then we'll get to the government records ombudsman.
I was just going to comment about the retention schedule as well, and then transitory correspondence is 3 years. And having said that, there's certain email that comes that's maybe a subscription service. Every day I get the Utah Daily Policy, the Utah Polls, I get the Federal Register. Those sort of subscription type emails, we actually delete off our system within 30 days because if I get them, probably every administrative employee gets them, and that just bogs down our system.
Okay. Rosemary?
I think that everyone has already said sort of what I was going to say, but going back to Susan Eisenman's comment at the beginning, email is a format, so you can't define retention by the fact that it's an email. You have to consider the content, and the transitory things can be deleted as soon as there's not a need for them. But the archives publishes retention schedules, and as has been mentioned, executive correspondence is permanent, and business correspondence is 7 years, and then there could be any number of different retentions based on what it is.
Did that answer the question? Okay. Hold on, Melody's up there.
Okay, so with the emails, I work for a sheriff's office, and so a lot of mine are like from the press wanting, usually it's just something easy, as a booking sheet and a mugshot. Sometimes they want more documents like that. With my question like that, like we said, our IT department can go back a year. After that, everything's automatically purged. With what we send out, should we be printing off everything that we send out and then have a hard copy of everything so that so the retention schedule is more clearly defined, or should we only keep electronic copies?
I would say that's the least efficient way to do it. And it's not very searchable. So it's one way to meet your obligations under your, retention requirements, but.
You'd be losing the metadata, would you not, David?
Yes, that's true. And I don't know if there's this specificity around metadata retention, but most, the request that the State Records Committee sees and the request that I see at my own company for electronic discovery, they're more and more interested in the metadata as opposed to just the content. And courts will tend to think it's not reasonable to retain a record that was created in an email system in a non-native format, meaning the email format, like a PST or something like that. So I would look for a better archiving solution than that. But that is one way to approach it.
Having said that, though, if one of those GRAMA requests and responses appealed, then you have an obligation to keep that for a longer retention. So you need to either think about migrating that to a different system, or you need to print it out so that you have that accessible for the retention period required.
And I would say if your policy says this is how you retain it, that's still defensible. So if you don't have the tools, but on the other hand, think about the cost of retrieving any kind of information from that hard copy record versus the cost of doing it electronically, and use that to justify an appropriate tool.
Okay, Rebecca, you have a question? Oh, this is an online question. We have 100 and something people online watching us.
Connie Burnside asks, we have people using Google Docs to share emails and documents between the attorneys and clients, and attorneys and staff. They have even used these for letters. Are they reviewable as well?
Anyone want to take that?
Well, technically, correspondence between attorney and client is privileged. However, I'm not sure that the process that was just mentioned is an appropriate way to protect your privileged email. I would certainly hope that it's labeled privileged to start off with. That's about the best I can do on that one.
I work in the legal office, and there's a lot of things that have to occur if it's legal communication. First of all, just because you CC an attorney does not mean it's attorney-client privilege or attorney work product. And so, secondly, as a records officer, you cannot waive the privilege for that attorney. You cannot waive it for the entity. And so, to the extent that you need to go through those type of records, I would ask that the attorney make a determination first, because you don't want to be in a position of accidentally waiving the privilege for your organization.
So you're saying you can still protect privilege and you can still review for privilege regardless of the vehicle.
Right.
So that makes sense.
Did you want to weigh in, Candy?
No, same thing, any communications I have with the city attorney's office, we kind of discussed it beforehand, and we label it as privilege or attorney-client communication.
Okay. All right, well.
Every attorney is going to have a different opinion, so.
Sure, yeah.
Just be sure you're on the same page as your attorney.
Let's go back to the city councilmen and how we, or council members, and how you manage their personal accounts. I'm interested in that as well. That comes up a lot, especially for maybe some of the smaller cities and towns. Does anyone want to take that? Colleen?
Well, I'm probably the only one up here that deals with council people. But, well, you know what? Because of the amount of requests for their emails, they have actually, stepped forward and gotten better about it. But back in the day, they didn't want to give stuff up. They didn't want anybody reading their emails. So it kind of goes along with that other question that you had in here. How do you get your upper management buy-in to this? Well, you know what? The first time they get one of their stupid emails put out there, they start thinking twice, which is really sad. But fortunately or unfortunately for us, it happens so often that our city council is 100% okay with, me having total access and them not using their personal accounts.
I would just say, establish a policy and train your council members on a regular basis.
Does anybody in the audience want to offer anything on that? As far as managing your council members or commissioners and their emails?
We all know that's a really fine line too, because all of those people are our bosses as well. But we do get a good opportunity when they come in as newly elected officials to try to steer them in the right direction. So it's a fine line.
We we have board of trustees, and we ask that if someone on our board receives an email on their personal email account, that always be forwarded to the board of trustees administrator so that it's within our system and searchable. And we ask that if they're going to send a response to the person, that they send it through that vehicle as well, that at least the administrator is CC'd. So it's, again, retained within our system and searchable in case we need to find it later.
Okay, thank you. So let's kind of go, we talked a little bit about policies. What policies do you have in place that address some of the challenges we've mentioned today? For example, the responses, searches, compiling, redacting emails. Can anyone kind of elaborate more on that as far as policies?
As far as the police department, again, it's, we just train our officers and those involved in the policy decision-making that they keep those emails, they put it somewhere where it's accessible, and, don't delete it, and that it be made available. If it's on their personal iPad, if it's on their work phone, all of that belongs to the city, if it's city business, and make sure that it's accessible to us.
Okay. Michelle?
Every new employee that comes to UTA goes to new employee orientation, and we have policies and procedures about our electronic communications, and they are told that anything in our system is subject to GRAMA, and that they have no expectation of privacy whatsoever. And it's reinforced when we do training every year so that people don't become lax after they've been there for a while.
Well, that's a wonderful segue into training. So what methods do you have for training, especially new employees, and follow-up or annual training for them as far as keeping your agency proficient on new programs and technology tools that are available out there? How do you respond to that as far as training?
We do annual training, and then I will try to meet with departments as much as I can just to answer questions that they may have. Sometimes when you have a big group of people going through a training, people are hesitant to ask too many questions. But if you can get a smaller group and have a real discussion, it actually is really helpful, not only for me to understand what records they may have and what concerns they may have about the communications they have, but maybe give them some advice on proper etiquette in communications and the expectation that it will be seen, so that you don't call the coworker that you don't like in the cubicle next door names to the other person, just certain things, knowing that all of that potentially could become public.
I'm not the right person to answer this question because I don't work for a public entity, but I will say that I've had, experience listening to people that work for public entities, and it seems to me that, what I have in place or what I'm putting in place is an annual training that is delivered via an online training tool. So if you have that available, I would do that, develop that and make sure that it's an annual training that's required for all city employees or entity employees. And then if you don't have that, what I've heard from, I have an ARMA colleague that works for one of the water districts, and she's got a lot of great training, but what she's learned is that a lot of times she tries to deliver too much, or she tries to deliver stuff that they don't need. The main thing is that they understand they have a responsibility under the policy and that they review the policy on a regular basis. So hitting the high points and making sure that they acknowledge that they understand their responsibility and that they know where the resources are. So if they come, and then they can invite you to a meeting or whatever, establish yourself as the expert so that they know where to go for advice.
No, like I said, we do it about twice a year, but we are a small city, so I'm lucky we have a monthly meeting. And so for like our public works guys and stuff, they're not really computer savvy, but they all use it and they all use it ARMA. So I just bring in props and I show them and I make them play games and stuff like that. So I kind of make it fun and incorporate it, and then just get to know them, and so they have a comfort level to ask you if they're not sure, because that's what my whole thing is. If you're not sure, ask me.
Great.
And as far as a police department, it's hard to have all of our officers sit down at the same time. But again, Salt Lake City has a new employee orientation where we try and give them as much information that they're going to remember that we can, really honing in that the devices they have belong to the city, and And like Michelle was saying, there's no expectation of privacy. And then usually ours stem from maybe a high-profile incident that we need to remind our officers that we'll send out in a chief's memo or a training bulletin, quarterly trainings, that sort of information. Anytime we can to refresh their memory that what they have on their person, their cell phones, their body cams, their anything they're sending email back and forth on the city email, it does belong to the city.
It's a good idea that I think you made me think of is if we have at ZIons Bank, they send out a monthly operations topic. And so they have like regular meetings, staff meetings in the branch offices. And so they highlight a specific training topic to talk about in those meetings. And one of them could be your responsibilities under records policy.
Yeah, definitely. Like our CIT unit, community intelligence unit, they're the ones who deal with a lot with the public. And, they're going to get emails from citizens that they've made contact with. So we're frequently reminding that unit that, well, when you do, you need to save it. It needs to be accessible. That, even though it's on your cell phone, it still belongs to the city.
Good, thank you. And I think Colleen had talked a little bit about this as far as the senior buy-in and getting the technology and the programs that you need. What tactics have you all used to get the senior buy-in so that you can do your jobs more efficiently and be able to be responsive to the public?
It's all about the money. You have to show the benefit in terms of dollars. And that's not real easy to do if you're not used to doing it. But I've been a records manager for a long time. And when I started and I've always worked for banks. And when I was first out in the world, I think we were maybe one step above the groundskeeper. Of course, they've all been outsourced now, but at the time they were employees and we were on the same level or something like that. And there was, we were always trying to sell this up the chain, but there's a tendency to try to sell your program with scare tactics. You might end up doing this, you might have, it only takes one case. It's all about the dollars. You have to put that risk in terms of dollars to the best of your ability and show them where they're spending money they don't need to spend, or they could spend that money to avoid spending money down the road. And, build that business case.
And I think you've all mentioned that sometimes it's that high-profile incident that kind of really starts the process going, unfortunately.
It is, but it also stalls after a while. That's not enough to get the job done. It's, you just really have to show the benefit. Once, if that does happen and it gets something going, you still have to show the benefit of what you're doing, not just implement a system to be implementing a system, and you have to show the benefit of it. So I think Michelle's talked a little bit about how she's done that.
Scare tactics actually work well where I work. What I have done in the past is if there's been a really great state records committee decision, I have sent that out to executive staff and say, we could be in a similar situation and we ought to think about X, Y, and Z. And those little constant nagging reminders have done a lot to help get budgetary, getting the budgets met.
Right, but what you're doing is saying we could avoid spending all this money on litigation, all this money on preparing appeals to the State Records Committee, or defense of appeals to the State Records Committee. The entities that argue in front of the State Records Committee, sometimes I'm just floored by how much money is being spent by us sitting there, by the city preparing, it's not usually the records officer that's sitting there representing the city, it's the city attorney. And a lot of times the city attorney is outsourced. So they're charging a pretty hefty fee to the city for their work on this defense. And so try to get your arms around what that's costing the city and how you might avoid that by spending that money somewhere else and being a little more proactive.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I like the point that you made about going back and reviewing the State Record Committee's decisions to kind of help you substantiate some of the equipment that you're going to need down the road. That's good. Go ahead, Colleen.
I was going to say, well, we have plenty of state records cases for our city, but what I do is I keep a log of every single GRAMA request I get and how much time it takes me, and kind of like a synopsis of what it was about, who asked for it and that. And then once a month, we put it in a management report to our city council and mayor. So they're aware of all of our GRAMA requests, not just every so often when we get hit with the big one. And so they're constantly seeing that. They're constantly seeing how much time I'm pulled away from my regular duties. Not that this isn't my regular duty, but it's just really time consuming. So they've just gotten really familiar with it and are very positive about giving us the tools that we need.
By the way, I'm not saying don't rely on scare tactics. If they work, they work. But it still needs to have some meat. Like you said, go back to the State Records Committee decisions.
All right. Anybody in the audience want to add to that? Melody, do you have any best practices you want to offer? Training, email management, GRAMA requests for emails? Police departments? Anybody wants to respond on that one? Oh, come on, you guys gotta have a question for us. There we go, we got one over here.
Is it me? I'm going to actually kind of go to a different topic and ask about text messages, because we have a lot of administrators who either are given a phone or have reimbursement for a phone. How could you ever keep text messages or have access to those, have any kind of way to monitor? And it sounds like anything electronic is a record. So what do we do there?
Believe it or not, there are tools that can capture text messaging. And we're about to implement one, but it's a cloud-based solution. We're going to spend $6 a month per user on that, and it will capture any social media account they register. It'll capture their text messages. It'll capture their email from multiple accounts. As long as it's included in the account, it's defined within the account, it can capture it. So you do need to be thinking about that, and you do need to include that in your training about, texts are out there, and you may not retain them internally, but the phone company has them. And as long as they're out there, somebody could make a case for getting them and cause you a lot of heartache. So,
Michelle, you look like you want to say something.
I'm just laughing because right before this started, I had an inquiry from someone asking about a bill that had just gone through the session, and there was a typo in the text message, and it said, "So what happened to gin on transit?" And what they were referring to was the gun in transit bill. And so I wrote back that we were highly discouraging open carry gin on transit. I'm just thinking if someone ever requested that, I'm wondering what the context they would think that would be. And,
On text messages, I'll just say that they are records. Most of text messages are kind of transitory because it's like, yeah, I'll be there in 5 minutes kind of thing or whatever. But if your city pays for your phone, your company pays for your phone, or partially pays for it, again, that no expectation of privacy. And I've just told all of our staff who have them, if you get a text that you know is a record, forward that to your email account and just put it in there, just to make it easier for us.
That's a good practice, yeah. Hold on, I see you. Let me get her right here.
Hey, speaking of people I know.
I work for a police department, and we are a consortium-wide police department. There's about 10 agencies. The records management system that we are currently using has an instant messaging feature. Would it be our duty to request those instant message records, or would it be the dispatch center that owns the software? Would it be their responsibility to maintain those and respond to GRAMA requests?
Well, in our situation, our IMS has the responsibility to maintain those. And we just work with the vendor to make sure that they know that essentially it's like a permanent litigation hold. You don't get rid of anything. And then our IMS people work with, extracting anything we need from that. Does that help?
If it's a record and you're turning it over, or you're relying on a third party, be sure that your contract takes into consideration that it's your data and that you own it, and that there's protections against, this entity failing and, not being able to provide access to the records. And also think about, what if I needed to retrieve a high volume of records and I'm getting charged every time I, retrieve those. So think about those things as well.
Okay, I have one up here. Kendra?
Basically asked what I was going to ask. If you have a policy that says your employees can only use texting for transitory type information, if they're doing anything business related, they have to use email or some other form. And then your service is actually the party that's retaining those text messages, you're not, then I don't see how you'd have any responsibility in producing that if somebody asked, because you would just say, it's transitory correspondence that we have, and if you want it, you're going to have to go to Verizon Wireless to get it. What do you think of that?
Michelle's all over this one.
We went out and procured a software system several years ago with the promise that the software system would do certain things. And we purchased that on good faith. Well, we got the system and it didn't perform as required. And we kept going back to the vendor and asking and asking and asking. And finally, we got a GRAMA request from a media outlet wanting certain data out of that. It would be similar to what you have there. We did not have the ability to extract that. And it turned into a pretty ugly fight at the State Records Committee. I'm just going to be honest about that. And then we had to elevate it to a court case. The vendor didn't do what they were supposed to do. We ended up making a compromise, and we had to have someone manually extract the data out of all of those records because they were entitled to have the information that was in the record, and it was not their fault that we couldn't access that. So I would be very, very careful.
But you actually hired someone so that you could manage it as a record, as opposed to determining that your employees would not use it for records, and then you just allow Verizon or AT&T or whoever retains that record to retain the record. So I could see how that would happen, but
I don't think you have a choice. If a record is created in the course and scope, whether it's transitory or not, I think you have an obligation to have access to it and to be able to produce it.
Okay.
Part of that discussion kind of clicked with me. I've learned over the years that never trust a software vendor to say, when they always will say yes, no matter what you ask, they will say yes, it will do that. It might not do that now. As soon as they say that, they're out. Don't buy something on faith because it never happens. So.
All right, well, we have a question down here.
Okay, my question kind of goes along with hers, and we all know social media is a real nightmare. So we have a group that's been created on Facebook. I won't give the name, it's a city group, and a council member started a discussion about a council item. And it has gone on for a week and a half, and I'll bet you there are probably 200 comments. And we have had council members who have joined in and staff members who have joined in. How do you handle that? It's on Facebook.
Colleen?
It's a nightmare.
Is it your city Facebook account?
Nope. But the council, it's not the city Facebook, but our council member started the comment. Council members have participated. It is a council issue.
You're not alone. And let's not even talk about their personal blogs.
Right.
I have no answer for that. That is such a new thing that we're dealing with
Right.
right now.
Thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, thank you. You're the same, whatever. Hey, thanks.
I'm in the same boat.
Just beware.
Yeah.
Sometimes the benefit of coming to these is finding out that you're not the only one suffering.
So we have 2 online questions. Go ahead, Ray.
You're fine. Sorry, we have Eileen Conder says, is it beneficial to adopt a county retention schedule? Or are we okay to use the archives, the state archives policy? And Debbie Colgan followed up with, I have the same questions for special districts.
The answer is yes.
That way.
Whatever the need of your entity is. If you have very specific records that are unique to your agency, I would go ahead and schedule a retention for those unique record series. But if you don't have anything that's different from what's already in place for the state archives, why go to the extra work? They've done it for you and they've done a great job.
Our city actually, right now, is on the state schedule, but because there's a lot of records on there that we don't even have or ever use, and there's some retention links that we're not exactly in agreement with, we're in the process of writing our own, and we'll be adopting it by ordinance sometime in the next few months. So it's just really what your entity needs.
Okay, Rebecca? Did you still have a question?
I thought you were calling on someone new. Yeah, so what about, we've talked about drafts of items that if you have a final draft, then the previous draft is not held. But what about email drafts that just never get sent?
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, a draft can only be a draft for so long until it will become a record if you can't stay a draft forever, because drafts, and I don't agree earlier with the person who said personal notes are GRAMA requestable, because they're not in the way we classify them. But drafts are not, what's the word, included in GRAMA when they're just a working draft document. Once it's adopted or becomes the contract or becomes the city council minutes or whatever, then yes, that's your record. But there's also something in there that says after, I don't know if there's a time frame, but it can't stay a draft forever just to hide it from the public.
Also, if you circulate that draft outside of people within the organization, you can lose that protected status.
Okay.
So is this going back to Google again? Yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah. So you ought to have some sort of policy that says don't keep a draft for longer than, I would think.
Okay, we got a question over here.
I know there are attorney-client privileges, but we have auditors, our own auditors that are independent, aside from the state. Are those communications between ourselves and our own auditors privileged?
Are they?
Communications of,
I don't know why they would be privileged. They're,
Maybe during the process when the audit's going on, because it's not
Say it
publicly
again?
published.
so like an investigation type thing?
Yeah. During the period when the audit's going on, because I have had requests for our audit when it's going on, and it's not really a finished document until the auditors have their findings. Once their findings come in, then it's published, and that's a public document.
but the notes that go on between during that time are privileged?
Correct.
Yeah, I would say the State Record Committee has upheld protected status for ongoing audits and investigations.
And if you have more questions about that, we have Rosemary, our government records ombudsman, and she'd be more than happy to talk to you about that a little bit more in depth as well. So it's very specific to 30510. Yeah, 63G-2-30510 in GRAMA is what that would fall under.
Can I just say, I see the 5-minute sign down here.
You may say something, David.
So I just want to say that I joined the State Records Committee almost 4 years ago, and I looked at this GRAMA law and I thought, how am I ever going to learn this? And the more I've listened to these appeals, the more I've learned about the law. And I was looking at it in preparing for this panel, and I said, you know what, this is a 50-page law, and I can't memorize it, but I can use it as a reference. And so a lot of these questions that get asked in these sessions, it's not that hard to find in the law, and you've got people like Rosemary that can help you find it if you can't find it. But I would say, if you haven't read it cover to cover, schedule an hour or two to do that on your calendar and read the thing cover to cover. And also, if you're preparing for a State Records Committee hearing, please read the administrative rules. They're even shorter. They're only like 8 pages. So, and you can talk to Nova about the rules that govern the process. So, it is a law. Laws are hard to read, but this one is not that really hard to read. And if you start to understand how it works, and the problem is every single part of the law refers to another part of the law or some other law that's not even in GRAMA. That's an overstatement, but it's tough to follow. But the more you do it, the more you'll find that it's a pretty good resource.
Okay. Well, I think you're doing your wrap up, right, David?
Yeah.
Okay. Colleen? All right. Colleen, you want to do a wrap up?
Sure. I would just advise you, like I said, keep organized, keep a log, know what's in there. Some people never get GRAMA requests. I get 2 or 3 or 5 a week. I don't know why, but I do. And another thing that's very helpful is have someone else in your office certify as a records officer, and use them as your second set of eyes. So I'll go through and redact, like I'm redacting 13,000 emails right now. So I'm probably going to miss a few things. So I always have that second set of eyes to go through and just scan and make sure that I got out everything that's supposed to be out. And that's about the best advice I can give you for now. Good luck.
All right. Thank you. Michelle?
I've just said everything I want to say today. Sorry.
Well, that wasn't tough.
Yeah, she was here earlier, so she did a great presentation. Go ahead, Candy.
I guess my advice, especially for police departments, is make sure your officers or those who create the records know they're creating records, and keep pounding that in their heads. What is a record? Yes, you're creating a record, and this is what we need to do with it. Because there's nothing worse than saying you don't have a record and the media is like, oh, yes, you do. Or you get to the State Records Committee and have to explain why you didn't know there's a record. So, and the organization thereafter of how you keep your records.
So,
David, you have something else?
yeah, you know, I can never shut up. I have this disease, it's called help David's talking and I can't shut up. So I would just say, going back to GRAMA and the question of whether email is a record or not, when you start reading GRAMA, go to 63G2 10322. And you'll see why email is a record or is not a record by reading that. But that's what the State Records Committee is looking at when you come before them.
All right. Well, I would like to thank the panel for volunteering for this. I thought it was an excellent conversation and discussion with the audience. I learned a lot. Thank you, audience. Thank you, online audience. So we have our closing key speaker, who is Tom Harrelson, who I'm really excited to hear from. And he is another State Records Committee member. So what do we have, a couple of minutes? We've got 15 minutes? Okay. Well, thank you so much.